So I'm sure you've asked yourself this before, but are you the same person that you were earlier in the day physically? Are you the same person that you were yesterday or the day before or a week ago or a month ago or a year ago or, 10 years ago if you're old enough? Well, I would argue that you probably are not physically the same person because your body physically anyways is constantly changing, right? Even if you're saying, oh, it's the brain or the mind, well, the brain is always changing, right? The physical aspects, the instantiations of your mind are always changing physically, right? Um, and so there is a level of a continuity, the sameness and difference and invariance, right? It keeps coming back. That's still maintained across different states in space and time. And so as someone who's very obsessed and fascinated with longevity, um, maybe there's a less conventional thought way of living longer and extending your radius and functionality across space and time. And, an example I can give to this is somebody like Steve Jobs, who's long physically been gone. He passed away, I believe, in 2011, and it's 2024 right now. So relatively recent in human history, but still far back for certain of us, right? And, there is an aspect of his soul, sort of like how Tom Riddle would split his soul into these Horcruxes. Now, maybe not in a negative light like that, but in a sense, Steve Jobs, through all the people that he interacted with physically, indirectly or directly, right? From his team to people that bought his products. Then, the products himself that he worked on or played a part in. All of his interviews, the movie dramatizations, all the books, all these different things. There is an aspect of himself, this aspect of the process of Steve Jobs, this abstraction, this more fundamental idea of a Steve Jobs resides and is stored in all those mediums. In a sense, you could say, history is almost the study and the format of, we store old souls in our history books. They reside in our history books, right? And that's why we can get these ideas of what people used to be, right? And in a sense, we may even take on aspects of themselves. So we're always kind of mimicking things and getting inspired by different things. Like, it's just like the saying that, you're a product of the people that you hang around, right? It's a very similar principle. And so back to the example of Steve Jobs, right? So he can long be gone physically, but still have a very real and practical effect on people alive today in this society and culture. And to expand this example more, right? Because I could say, Steve Jobs, in a sense, an aspect of him resides in me right now. I think I was very much inspired by some of his ways of thinking in terms of product design and just design language in general, and ways of thinking about customer and product interactions and stuff like that. But also, like, you can think of somebody who's still alive today. So somebody like Christopher Nolan, the director, he is still alive. He's doing quite well, but I don't have to physically know him personally, right, to be affected by him and have an aspect of himself that resides in me, right? So I grew up watching his films. I was very, I'd watch all of his interviews and read all these different recollections of people that worked with him and the way he built his films. Like, I still remember that old video of him on the chalkboard talking about the timeline of Memento, right? That was stored on the internet. There's an aspect of himself, his way of perceiving reality, functioning inside of reality, his perceptual language that he was dealing with, that was, put on the medium of this chalkboard and into the chalk, and then the person that was recording it, and then now, in this case, on the internet these days. And so, yeah, even right now, if Christopher Nolan is still alive, and through something like his films or his interviews, there's an aspect of his soul, his essence, some invariant aspect of who he is, that's distributed in me, in you, and all the people that are watching and consuming that information, sort of like how we consume food, which are remnants of other organisms, right? We fuel ourselves by the graves of other past organisms, right? And that's also when we pass away, what happens? Our aspects of ourselves get redistributed back into the environment, and it's this continuous, recycling process, right? And that's the same thing with the essence of somebody, their soul, their ideas. So what I wanted to get with this is that you could be, just giving you a different lens of this, right? Is you can be alive or passed away physically and still have a very real level of cognition and drive and agency in the culture or society or the complex system that you distributed aspects of yourselves in, right? And as a thought experiment, it could be fun to think about, if you took like somebody like, all the people Steve Jobs worked with, for instance, all of the recollections of him in books or whatever, and all of his products, and you raise somebody very similar to how they were raised, they may not be physically exactly identical, but they may end up having very similar things, even down to things like something like tongue posture or the diet and the way that was affecting their skin and their hair and their teeth and the rest of their body. Like, if you really strictly take these distributed aspects of somebody's soul and their essence and you reorganize that back in a similar context, you may end up having something that looks very similar. And this is also represents like how we see things, go through different paths in evolution that didn't seem to have an original, similar point where they could, diverged, but they can come from very different paths in time and space and look very similar, which is almost like what happened with calculus, right? And so I think it's really fun to think about these ideas of these perceptual organisms, these cognitive, perceptual, linguistic organisms, conceptual organisms, right? That propagate themselves in a physical and in a non-physical space. Because in a sense, language is non-physical. Cognition is non-physical. The experience, the quality of it is not necessarily physical. Yet it propagates itself, right? And that's what, in a sense, I'm doing that right now. There's an aspect of myself that's reproducing and propagating and maintaining continuity across different states in time and space by making this video, and then you're watching it. And just like the evolution process where, when it iterates, it's always exposed to difference in this level of noise, right? Of something to interpret differently. And so, if you interpreted this exactly how I mean it, then there would be no difference. You would be me. But the only reason that change and adaptation and growth and evolution happens is because I'm instantiating an aspect of myself in this language, right? And then you're perceiving it differently in some way that's subjective. And then now that creates a different output. Otherwise, if we were seeing things the exact same way, then there'd be nothing to happen. There'd be no dynamics, right? Because again, you can't have sameness without difference. And so I just wanted to sort of ramble on about this idea of these perceptual organisms, right? These linguistic organisms. And the way that you can maybe achieve a form of longevity that's maybe more robust than just physically being there. Because a lot of the times when people in longevity talk about living longer and defying aging, it's like, okay, well, some people will say, oh, I want to live longer, but I don't want to be old and decrepit while I'm like 200 years old. And so, a lot of people in longevity would rather say, well, what we actually want to go for is like, let's say you do have to live 200 years old, but you live so perfectly until you're 200 and then you just drop and there's no suffering. And in a sense, yeah, I mean, from a physical perspective, I think that's interesting, but you may actually achieve way more longevity than imaginable if you take this distributed cognition aspect of yourself and you're an influencer in a sense. You're always distributing aspects of your soul and your mind to things around you, right? To the people that you interact. You make an impression on them. You make an impression. When we make an impression on a piece of paper, or we carve, or we pencil, or draw something, it's the same thing, right? And that could also be talking about the plasticity of the substrate. And there's so many different things that I see that evolution in physical terms is very much the exact same way that things non-physically will reproduce and propagate and maintain continuity. And so I want to go into this in more technicality in a future video, but today I just wanted to sum this up and say that maybe this idea of longevity is not necessarily extending yourself physically. Maybe that's not the most powerful way. Maybe a more advantageous way for the society and culture as a whole are for things to reproduce and maintain longevity through different means. Maybe you do live longer physically, but maybe it's also about the process aspect of who you are, the conceptual aspect, the invariant aspect of you, and how that distributes amongst other states. I don't know, maybe just something to kind of think about.